Turn on the recording. Okay. It's recording by the way to now, so you'll be able to get the recording afterwards.
Before we begin, can I record it on my local computer as well, or is that not?
Yeah, you can, for sure. No problem. It should come up on the Nair YouTube channel as well. Fine. So if anyone is just arriving, I've just posted the Myri Maccabees, the sources for the share on the chat. You should be able to get them on Google Drive. Otherwise, don't worry too much about it. They should all be coming up as well on the screen as we go. So first of all, thank you for joining me. See if I can do something quickly. Here we go. First of all, thank you for joining me this evening. Thank you for this really incredible opportunity to speak. It always is a pleasure. Yeah, sorry, I've been told recording is not allowed. Apparently, that's okay. Fine, no problem. Yeah, so thank you for joining me. Thank you for this incredible opportunity to speak. Just a brief disclaimer. It's brief because I'm neither a rabbi nor a historian. I'm not sure which one I'm less of, so I'm really not qualified to say too much about the topic at hand. I've done a fair amount of research into the topic in the past, so I should hopefully be able to open up a conversation, at least open up the topic, and I hope that it's clear for you. The way the show is gonna work, we'll start with a general view of the Apocrypha, what the Apocrypha is, what is the general orthodox view towards the Apocrypha, and then following that, we're going to zoom in on the story of Judith or Yehudis, what relevancy that is to Hanukkah, etc., etc. Unfortunately, I don't think we're going to have time this evening to discuss the Maccabees, which are a set of apocryphal books about Hanukkah, and that's just for time constraint reasons. But otherwise, we should have time for everything, I hope, and wish me luck. Yeah, as I said before, if anyone's got any questions, please post them to me privately on chat. That would be ideal. So for the last time, at least for now, I'm going to post these source sheets for anyone who's just joined. That's the link to the source sheets. And let us begin. So I'm going to share with you a PowerPoint. This should have all the sources on it as well. You should be able to see this and hopefully see my beautiful face as well as we go. So Yehudis and the Maccabees, the Apocrypha's place in Jewish thought. Why Judith and the Maccabees? Judith is a very personal topic for me. Both my grandmothers are called Judith or Yehudis. So I thought, let's do a bit of research into the name. I think they may be joining us this evening. So it is a personal topic, and we'll see how it goes. So what are the Apocrypha? Generally speaking, I have to start with a little bit of history, very briefly. Adam is born in the year 0 of the Jewish calendar. Abraham is born about a couple of thousand years later. Torah is given, and then this is the main part of the history that's going to be interesting to us. The Torah is given about the years 2448 in the Jewish calendar. A few hundred years later, the first temple is built, the first Beis Hamikdash. A few hundred years after that, the first temple is destroyed, the Beis Hamikdash is destroyed. A few years after that, very shortly after that, 70 years, the second temple was built, and then it's destroyed a few hundred years later. And then many thousands of years after that, it is us today sitting on Zoom, which is all very exciting. Now, main points in history for our relevancy this evening. The Torah was given in the year 2448 or 1313 BCE, about 3,000 years ago or so. And that was when Moshe gave us the Torah, etc., etc. A few hundred years later, first Beis Hamikdash was born. That is the time of about Shmuel. Shmuel HaNovi, David, Shaul, all these famous figures from Tanakh. The second Beis Hamikdash, the first Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, second Beis Hamikdash was built. And at that point, we have Ezra, Malachi, Daniel, Esther, all of these people. And all of these books in Tanakh are written right at the beginning of the second Beis Hamikdash era. Okay, so if we look at the books of Tanakh, you've got it's a bit complicated who wrote each of them. There's a Gemara about it in Baba Basra, but generally speaking, we have the Torah and then the Nevi'im split into two eras: the Nevi'im Rishonim, which lived about the time of the first Beis Hamikdash, the Nevi'im Achronim, which lived later, and then we have a whole set of the Ksuvim. Okay, And just to go back very quickly, we start with the Torah, and then the last book of Tanakh in terms of chronology is about the time of Malachi. It's not clear which book is actually last, but it's Malachi, and we're talking at the beginning of the Second Temple era. Now, the Apocrypha, the word Apocrypha comes from the Greek apokrytein, I can't pretend to pronounce that. And the Apocrypha were written just after that, generally speaking. They're a set of an eclectic mix of works. We have books about Odom, Moshe, Malachim, demons, angels. It's an incredibly varied mix of works. Some of them were written originally in Greek, some of them in Hebrew, but importantly, they were all written, 98% of them were written in the last years of the second Beis Hamikdash. And this is going to be very important as we go through. Yeah, so as discussed, there are a very, very broad range of books. One very important one for the Shir, which is going to come up a fair bit, is a book called Ben Sira. Which is a collection of wise sayings, very similar to Mishlei. So that's the book of Ben Sira, and it was written as well during the late Second Temple era. Okay, and due to their broadness of the types of books in the Apocrypha, they're viewed very differently within Orthodoxy. Some of them are quoted in the Gemara. Some of them are viewed basically as a joke, and most of them are somewhere in the middle. So it's very hard to give a very clear picture, but hopefully we'll give some broad brush strokes as to the general way these things are viewed. Okay, so to start with, apologies. This is just a fragment of the Ben Sira from the Cairo Geniza. We've got a few fragments in Cambridge, which is nice and local. Yeah, as you can see, very, very hard to read Hebrew. Either way, this brings us on to the first question which we're going to deal with, which is why aren't these books, why aren't the Apocrypha in the Tanakh? What makes us uniquely view Tanakh as part of our religion or an integral part of our religion, whereas the Apocrypha not so? To whatever degree we do view them as important, we'll discuss, but they're definitely not part of Tanakh. So what makes them not part of Tanakh? So that's the first question we're going to deal with. And for each book in the Apocrypha, you'll see some scholarly articles discussing why or why not is brought in Tanakh. But I'm just the basic view is as follows. So in Moreh Nevuchim, the Rambam says, he discusses 10 different levels of prophecy. And here's an excerpt from the second degree of prophecy, which he calls Ruach HaKodesh. And he says as follows: the second degree is this: a person feels as if something came upon him and as if he has received a new power that has encouraged him to speak. And he carries on a little, saying how what he'll do with this power. And then he finishes and he says, David composed the Psalms, and Solomon the book of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, I can't even pronounce these, the Song of Songs, and the Song of Solomon by the Spirit, etc., etc. And he basically is writing that the Kesuvim, therefore they are called the Kesuvim, or the writings, because they are written by men inspired by the Holy Spirit, i.e. Ruach HaKodesh. So the Rambam makes a clear distinction here between Kesuvim, Nevi'im, and the rest of literature. We have the Torah, which was given by Moshe. We have the Nevi'im, which are on a higher level of prophecy. And we have the Kesuvim, or the writings, which are on a lower level of prophecy, but still written with a degree of prophecy, written, inspired in the words of the Rambam, translated by Rabbi Friedman, Dr. Friedman, inspired by the Holy Spirit. Okay, so that's what the Rambam says. And the Rambam didn't invent this idea. This idea came much earlier. There's a general halacha that scrolls of Tanakh are metame, they make impure one's hands. Okay, so this is why when the Baal Koreh in Shul will read from a Sefer Torah, he'll use a yad, or a metal hand, in order to point in the Torah, because one should not touch the actual script of the Torah or even the parchment of the Torah, because it is metame one's yodayim. The Mishnah in Yodayim says, Kol Kisvei HaKodesh metame hayodayim. It says that all of the Kisvei HaKodesh, all of Tanakh is metame the yodayim, and the Tosefta adds, the Tosefta is written the similar time to the Mishnah. Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh Omer, he holds that Shir Hashirim Metame Es Yadayim Mipnei Shene'emra Baruach HaKodesh. The Shir Hashirim is Metame one's Yadayim. It is considered part of Tanakh in that sense, because it was said with Ruach HaKodesh. However, Koheles, which was also written by Shlomo HaMelech, is Eino Metame Es Yadayim, does not make one's hands impure. She'eino elo mechochmosoi shel Shlomo. Because it was not written with a Ruach HaKodesh, with the Holy Spirit. It was written simply through Shlomo's wisdom. As you can see in the Mishnah above, we do not paskin like this opinion. We say in the Mishnah, Shir Hashirim v'Koheles Metame Es Yadayim. They are both fully part of Tanakh. However, we can see from Reb Shimon ben Manasseh's statement in the Tosefta that in order to be considered part of Tanakh, in order to be considered one of these scriptures, which is Metame Yoyodayim, it has to be written, it has to be Ne'emra Baruach HaKodesh. This perhaps is the Rambam's source, a much earlier source from the times of the Mishnah, that all of the books in Tanakh have to be written with a Ruach HaKodesh. Now, when did Ruach HaKodesh finish? This also we have clear Makoros for. In Sanhedrin we say, Ton Rabbanan, it was taught in a Tanaic source in the times of the Mishnah, Mishamesu Neviim Ha'achroinim, when the final prophets died, Chagai, Zachariah, Umalachi, Nistalka, it was removed, Ruach HaKodesh MeYisrael, the Holy Spirit, or this low level of Nevuah was removed from Yisrael. So if we look at our time period, we can see that Malachi lived right at the beginning of the second Beis HaMikdash era, just before the Hanukkah story took place. Yeah? And that is when this Ruach HaKodesh, that required prophetic vision, left Klal Yisrael, left the Jewish people, and it is at that point that the Apocrypha started being written. So the Tosefta itself says, Hagilyonim Sifrei Minim, Eino Metame Es Yadayim, certain books from heretics do not metame one's yadayim, do not make impure one's hands. Sifrei ben Sira, which, as we said before, is one of the Apocrypha, similar to Mishlei. V'chol haSefarim, and all of the works, shenichtovu mekan ve'elech, which were written mekan ve'elech after Ben Sira, historically after Ben Sira, einon metame es yadayim. It is impossible for them to be metame es yadayim. The Tosefta gives a general rule: they are never going to be metame es yadayim. Why is this? As we pointed out, when Malachi passed away at the beginning of the second Beis HaMikdash, one of the Anshe Knesset HaGadolah, at that time period, the final works were making their way into Tanakh. Okay, because at that point it was the last time that Ruach HaKodesh was in the Jewish people, and therefore those were by definition the last works that could have made it into Tanakh. The Apocrypha, which were written afterwards, or 90%, 95% of the Apocrypha, which were written afterwards, it's impossible for them to make their way into Tanakh simply because they were not written in the time of prophecy. Okay, so that deals with the basic question of why the Apocrypha not in Tanakh. Primarily, the answer is that they were written too late, and they were not written with Ruach HaKodesh. And there may be numerous other problems, that they were written with the opposite of Ruach HaKodesh, and that they were lots of rubbish as well, which are written in the Apocrypha. But basically, there's no way that they could have made their way into Tanakh. Okay? Just by the way, the dates here are very, very rough, depending on different calculations, so do not take them as gospel by any stretch. Either ways, moving on. So we've discussed now the Apocrypha have not made their way into Tanakh because there is no way they were written with the level of Nevuah required, which is fine. But are we allowed to read them? Is there any problem reading them? Can we learn from them? Can they teach us anything? And that is the question that I'd like to deal with for a little bit of time, and then hopefully we'll have time to focus on the Judith and Yehudis and the Hanukkah story as well. So the Mishnah says in Sanhedrin as follows, Rabbi Akiva Omer, so if anyone is joining late, then feel free to private message me questions. I can't promise I'll look at them, but hopefully I will leave time to take a look at them. The Mishnah in Sanhedrin says as follows. So we discussed, again, just a quick recap, discussed the Apocrypha, couldn't have been made into Tanakh, they were written too late. Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, the level of prophecy required to be in Ksuvim, had already left the Jewish people. So now, can one read them or not? So the Mishnah says, Kol Yisrael yesh lahem chelek lo'olam haba. Everyone in the Jewish people has a chelek lo'olam haba. This is not to exclude non-Jews, as is clear in the Rambam, but everyone in the Jewish people has a chelek. Ve'elu she'ein lahem chelek lo'olam haba. These are those who do not have a space in olam haba. Ha'omer ein tchias hamesim min haTorah, one who denies the resurrection of the dead. Ve'ein Torah min hashamayim, denies the authority or the origins of the Torah. Ve'epikores, which is a specific theology, which is keneged Torah. Rabbi Akiva omer af hakorei b'seforim hachitzonim. Even one who reads seforim hachitzonim. A person who reads from the seforim hachitzonim has no chelek in olam haba, which is obviously an incredibly strict punishment. So what are these seforim hachitzonim? The Gemara says, Tana, we learned in a Brisa and an early Tanakh source, Besifrei Minim. This means books of the heretics. There are different girsas in the Gemara. It could be Sifrei Tzidukim, may have been censored. It may have been Sadducees' books. It may have been censored very early on in the history of the Gemara. But that's the first opinion, or the first interpretation. It means Sifrei Minim. It means heretical works. Rabbi Yosef Omer, Rabbi Yosef adds on, Besefer Ben Sira, this work called Ben Sira, which we discussed, one of the Apocrypha, a collection of seemingly wise statements. Nami Osir Lemikri is also Osir to read. And this would fall into the Mishnah's clarification of Hakari B'Svarim Echitzonim, which Rabbi Akiva says would leave you no portion in the world to come. Okay, and this obviously should bother us, as in why B'Sifrei Minim we perhaps would understand. If you're reading heretical works, the likelihood of those opinions making their way into your thought process is incredibly high, and therefore it's likely Rabbi Akiva is saying you're going to have the wrong thoughts in order to not make into Olam Haba. But what is the problem with Ben Sira? Why should that have such a punishment attached to it? Just briefly, Sifrei Minim, the Yad Ramah, who's a commentary on Sanhedrin and one of the Rishonim, adds on as well that even Sforim which are a mix of Perushim on the Torah, which are true and fit with the morals of Chazal, as well as interpretations which people have come up with on their own, these are also included in Sifrei Minim, which is quite an expansion of the term. On the other hand, the Meiri, in the base of Achira, he is also a Rishon, and he comments that one may read these works in order to teach others how to avoid them or to respond to them. So with those brief clarifications, we can now explore, why is Sefer Ben Sira a problem? What is the problem with Sefer Ben Sira? It seems to be a nice work of good advice, or seemingly good advice. So Rashi explains, Shomi Yitzchaki, one of the Rishonim, he says, Rabbi Yosef Omer Af B'Sefer Ben Sira would also be also to read. And why is that? Sheyesh bo divrei havai. It has worthless words. Uvo aleihem lidei bittul Torah. And because of these worthless words, you're going to come to bittul Torah. You are going to waste your time in this world away, and you're not going to be doing what the Torah requires you to do. You're not going to be learning the Torah. Now, this seems to be a much lower level of problem than the Sifrei Minim. The Sifrei Minim, the heretical works, that seems to be obviously a major problem. These works of the Ben Sira seems to be, and it's clear from the Gemara, it seems to be a problem of worthless work. It seems to be a work which is a waste of time. And this is clear from the Gemara as well. The Gemara says, even at the conclusion of the Gemara, Rav Yosef himself says, Milei ma'al yasa de'isbei, meaning the valuable material that is found in Sefer Ben Sira, darshinon lehu. The milei ma'al yasa, those valuable stuff, darshinon lehu, in public, we will expound upon them. I.e., we're not going to ignore Sefer Ben Sira entirely. Just the bits of Sefer Ben Sira, which Rashi called Divrei Havai and Bittul Torah, that stuff we're going to ignore, and that stuff one may not read. However, the Milei Ma'al Yasa, the valuable material, that for sure we'll read and teach in public, and there's absolutely no problem with that, according to Rav Yosef. In fact, the Talmud Bavli itself in numerous places, quotes the Sefer Ben Sira. For example, in Baba Basra, it quotes the Sefer Ben Sira, which says, I'll translate it. It says, I've weighed everything on scales, and there's nothing lighter than straw. But something which is lighter than straw, something which is more worthless, is a groom who lives with his father-in-law, which is not great. And worse than a groom who lives with his father-in-law is a guest who invites a guest. If a guest starts inviting other guests to the Shabbos meal, then that is not viewed particularly highly. And even worse than a guest who invites a guest is someone who responds to a question before fully listening to it. Either way, this wise saying from Ben Sira, the Bavli itself has brought it in a discussion. Clearly, it is not also to read Sefer Ben Sira at all or quote it. There are some valuable aspects to it. So this clear chiluk, this clear difference between the Sifrei Minim, the heretical works, and Sefer Ben Sira, which has some waste of time statements. The Gemara works out which of its statements are worthy and which ones aren't. That we'll quote the worthy statements of. The Gemara itself does. The Ritva himself points out from here. He says that we can see from this Gemara, the fact in Baba Basra that we're quoting Ben Sira, that when we said that Sefer Ben Sira is also to read, that's only to read it as part of a fixed learning schedule. If you make that an integral part of your reading list, Sefer Ben Sira is on there with the rest of Tanakh, or with the rest of your valuable reading, with the Gemara and the Mishnayos, that is going to be a problem. But to just read it occasionally to find this chokhmah or musar, which the Ritva calls it, to find these words of actual wisdom, that is absolutely acceptable with the Sefer Ben Sira. The Nemuch Yosef there, unfortunately, we don't have time to read it, but the Nemuch Yosef says exactly the same thing. So just to conclude where we're up to at the moment, we've seen, generally speaking, why the Apocrypha were written and are too late to be included within the corpus of Tanakh. We've also seen that even though Rabbi Yosef seems to say that Sifrei Minim, the heretical works, which Rabbi Akiva says you have no chelek in Olam Haba for reading them, seems to be Rabbi Yosef is adding to that Sefer Ben Sira, one of the apocryphal works. Rav Yosef himself, and it's clear from the Gemara and from the Rishonim, he does not mean to equate them. It's explained that Sefer Ben Sira has much material which is a waste of time to read. It's rubbish and guff, one might say, and that stuff is Bittul Torah and will cause you to lose your chelek and Olam Haba should you make it a fixed part of your schedule. However, the aspects of it which are chokhmah and musa, which are valuable, we are dorshin on, we teach them in public, and we learn them, and on occasion you can read them, and etc., and those are valuable. Okay, so until now, Ben Sira, the book of Ben Sira, has not really been, we haven't really been discussing the Apocrypha per se. Ben Sira has just been an example of a work which is neither Sifrei Minim, which is neither a heretical work, but it has some useful aspects to it, and therefore it was the example in the Gemara of a work which one can read to an extent, but not too much. Which doesn't seem to tell us much about the status of the Apocrypha as a whole within Orthodox thought. But there are sources which indicate a strict view towards the Apocrypha, which we are about to see now. So if anyone has any questions, by the way, feel free to post them now. I'll try and take a look. Fine, there's one question there which I have answered with pleasure. Fine. So moving on, feel free, I'll try and take a look at the questions throughout. There's a Medrash in Shemos Rabbah where we have a statement of Reish Lakish, who says that just like a bride is adorned with 24 jewels or types of jewelry, you can imagine a Taimani bride. If you see their wedding garbs, it's incredibly ornate with different jewels and different dresses. Probably how they look like in the times of the Gemara as well. Kach Talmid Chacham tzorech leyozoriz be'esrim ve'arba sfarim. A Talmid Chacham, a scholar, has to be alacritus with 24 books. He has to be careful to learn the 24 books of Tanakh. So this is a bit unclear exactly what Reish Lakish is trying to say. He's trying to tell us to learn Tanakh, which is unfortunately a message which has fallen on deaf ears in the recent, in numerous societies recently. But either way, there are clearer statements discussing what these 24 books are and the importance of the 24 books of Tanakh. So the Yerushalmi, when discussing the same statement of Rabbi Akiva, says the following. It says, Hakor b'sfarim chitzonim, it flips on its head. It says that the main problem is Kore Sifrei ben Sira, the Sifrei ben Lana, which is another example of a book in the Apocrypha. Avol Sifrei Hamirim, books from a Homer, V'chol Sfarim Shnechtovu Mekan V'helech, and any books written after Homer or from that time period onwards. Hakore Bohem, anyone who reads them, Kakore Be'egeres, as if he's reading a letter, and the Gemara will go on to explain that it's permitted to read them to an extent, but not too much. And everyone is astonished, all the commentaries are astonished by this Gemara. It seems to flip everything on its head. We have the Gemaras themselves in the Yerushalmi and in the Bavli, who quote and discuss statements of Ben Sira. So how can that be the main problem of Rabbi Akiva? On the other hand, Sifrei Homer and other works of major theological problems, how can you say that one may read these to an extent? This is what causes some commentators to therefore just say that there's a misprint in the Gemara. It was scrambled over the years. We have numerous examples of this. And actually, you should flip it around so that it also follows the same pattern of the Bavli, that the main problem is works of Apikosim and Minim, and Ben Sira is a secondary, not so severe problem. However, there are sources that say that no, there's actually a different route. For example, the Koheles Rabbah explains that anyone who brings more than 24 Sepharim into his house has brought mehumah, or great confusion, into his household. And this is explained all by the Margolies Hayam, who lived fairly recently, who wrote a book on Sanhedrin. He explains that there's actually a more fundamental problem with the Apocrypha. And he explains that at the time when Rabbi Akiva lived, and they were just closing and sealing our corpus of Tanakh, then there was a major problem that different communities in Israel had different Sepharim, which they enjoyed, which may have been valuable to them. And if we don't make a very strict rule of exactly which of the 24 books are part of our religion and were written with Ruach HaKodesh, and say these are the 24, none others, then the religion would unfortunately fall into a situation where some communities have these books, some have these books, which actually has occurred within Christianity. Different churches have different books of the Apocrypha within their corpuses. Others argue, some have different versions of them, etc., etc. So the Margolies Hayam explains that in order to avoid this, there was a particular gezerah, particular enactment of the Rabbanon, with the knas, with the fine, with a punishment of losing your chelek in Olam Haba for not listening to them. And this problem is specifically by the Apocrypha. And less so is it a problem by Sifrei Minim and heretical books, because they may threaten you individually, but they don't threaten to rip apart the Jewish nation's basic works and corpus called Tanakh. And that would therefore be quite a radical view based on the Yerushalmi in the Apocrypha's place within Judaism. In that there was originally a major problem with the Apocrypha. They're written in such a similar style to Tanakh and at such a similar time that there's a concern they'd be added to Tanakh, so we had to have a specific safeguard to stop that from happening. Margolies Hayam continues and says, however, in the later eras, in the times of the Amoraim and the Gemaras, where people do quote Ben Sira, it was already post the time of the Takana. It had already been established, the corpus of Tanakh, and once the corpus of Tanakh had already been established, there was no longer such a concern. And therefore, it was absolutely fine to read Ben Sira and to quote Ben Sira in the Gemara, because that was post the times of the Gezerah. That concludes this section. Obviously, this opens numerous cans of worms and cans of different things. For example, what constitutes a Sifrei Minim? Obviously, different communities have taken very different views of how much one may read from outside sources. to what extent is Bittul Zman a problem if you're going to be Mevatel the Zman anyway, etc., etc. Just based on this discussion, it's an opening to a huge discussion about how to view secular works particularly, and the Apocrypha specifically as well. So that is a general view of the basic sources for the Apocrypha. Now I'd like to spend a little bit of time discussing Yehudis. Hopefully I'll finish about 1:45. I hope that's not too late. I've been told to finish sometime around then. Discussing Yehudis, the Hanukkah story, etc., etc. So this is a new part of the show. Even if you lost me somewhere or I lost you somewhere along the way, this is a new section and a very interesting section at that. So there's one major halachic result, perhaps, and 3 minhagim, which relate to the fact that some of the miracles of Hanukkah occurred through women. So we'll go through them very quickly. The major halachic nafkamina, the major halachic consequences found in Masechah Shabbos, it says that Noshim chayovis b'nei Hanukkah, a woman is, despite the fact that a woman is normally exempt from time-bound positive mitzvahs, a woman is chayiv to light Hanukkah candles. Why is this? Rashi explains, Al yidei isha na'aseh hanes. There are other ways of understanding the Gemara, but the understanding of Rashi is that because through a woman, the miracles or some of the miracles of Hanukkah happened, that means that they are also included within the mitzvah of the menorah and the mitzvah of Hanukkah. This is even clearer in the Tosfos, in Pesachim. He says that he's talking about the 4 cups of wine which we drink on Seder night. It's Perish Rashbam, the Rashbam explains, Sha'al Yodom Nigolu, because of the women we were redeemed from Egypt for whatever reason. You can see in the Midrashim regarding the Exodus of Egypt, that was primarily because of women. V'chein b'Megillah, the women are also obligated to listen to the Megillah al Yad, or to read the Megillah al Yad Esther, because Esther was an integral part of the Purim story. Uv'Chanukah al Yedei Yehudis. On Hanukkah, women are responsible to light Hanukkah candles because there was a woman called Yehudis who did some of the miracles. Now, so that is the halachic nafkamina number 1. One major halachic nafkamina from the fact that some of the miracles were done through women or by women. They are obligated to light the Hanukkah candles unless they are yotzei through someone else. And there are now a few minhagim which are relevant as well. Just to see them very briefly. The Shulchan Aruch says that women have a particular minhag not to do any work during the time when the Hanukkah candles are lit. So that as well is explained by some because they particularly were involved in the miracle. Another one is that the Ramah brings in Shulchan Aruch that there is a minhag to eat cheesy or milky foods on Hanukkah because the miracle lefi shahanes Na'aseh b'cholov she'echilu Yehudis es ha'oyev. Yehudis fed milk to the enemy, and therefore there is a minhag, a tradition, to have milky foods on Hanukkah. This the Ramah brings. The source from that is a Ran and a Kolbo. Both of them were shonim. I will just read the Ran because it's a bit shorter. It says, Va'alidei isha na'aseh nes. Through a woman there was a miracle. Domrina b'medrash, we learn in a medrash. The Bito Shel Yochanan, the daughter of Yochanan Kohen Gadol, was the father of Matisyahu, the grandfather of Yehuda HaMaccabee. So he had a daughter. Hechilo l'roi sha'ovdei glulim gevina l'shechroiso. She fed milky foods to the head of the Greeks in order to make him drunk and tired. V'chotches rosho uvorchu kulam. She chopped off his head and they all fled. Who's the they fleeing? We'll see. And this is why we have milky foods on Hanukkah. Okay, the people fleeing, by the way, was, we'll see that later. The Wikipedia, I'm sorry I brought a Wikipedia article as one of my Macabees, but there we go. There's a minhag in Tunisia and in some northern African communities that to celebrate a Chag Habanot, some people want to re-establish in Israel as well, a festival marking women and their contribution to Judaism on Hanukkah particularly, and to mention Yehudis particularly as well. This is a very old minhag. There's an island called Jerba, I can't pronounce that, in Tunisia, where it's a very interesting story that Kohanim, after the Beis Hamikdash got destroyed, they were exiled to Jerba, and there's these incredibly old minhagim there, one of which is this Chag Habanot, this Chag Habonos, this celebration of women which occurs on Hanukkah. Okay, and also as well, just a bit of fun as well, we have menorahs through the centuries which have depicted women. This one's a bit clearer. Someone censored this one for me. Through the ages, someone has taken the liberty of censoring the female figure on the menorah. This one's a bit clearer. We have Yehudis on the menorah chopping off someone's head. And this is from the 1720s in Germany. I thought it was quite fun, that. There's a few menorahs like that in the Israel Museum's collection. Either way, what comes out from the Rishonim and from these halachas is a very unclear picture. There was some woman called Yehudis, who was the daughter of Yochanan Kohen Gadol, the sister of Matisyahu, and Yehuda HaMaccabee's aunt, and she killed a certain officer by chopping off his head, and therefore we have people escaping, and therefore we eat cheese, and also in the Kolbo it says that she brought her head back to a city, and then they won a war. It's an incredibly vague picture, and we have to ask, where is the source for this? There's no Gemara, there's no Mishnah which discusses this woman called Yehudis. We don't have a Megillah, any Megillah which is of any particular age which discusses this. So where is the source for this? So one suggestion is the source is from an apocryphal book called Judith, of which there's a brief summary here. This is from the Vulgate version. The Vulgate was a very early Latin translation of the Christian Tanakh. Very briefly, I'll just very quickly read through the story for time reasons. The war opens with a successful campaign waged by Nebuchadnezzar, king of the Assyrians. He sends his chief of staff, Holofernes, to basically defeat everyone who didn't join him in the war. The Jews of a city called Bethulia, block their path towards Jerusalem, and he laid siege to the city. He asks his Ammonite friend, Achior, and he says, will I win this war? Achior says, no, maybe their God will protect them. But he carries on with the siege nonetheless. The people of the town press their leaders to surrender. At this point, the pious, beautiful widow Judith steps onto stage. Judith, who leads an ascetic and solitary life, summons the leaders to her home and reprimands them. She takes matters in her own hand. She prays, bathes, removes her widow's weeds, dressed to kill, quote unquote. She leaves Basilia for the enemy camp. She basically deceives the enemy general, Holofernes, and promises to deliver the Jews to him. So Holofernes invites Judith to a party, tries to seduce her. He manages to grab his head, chops it off with a sword. She manages to escape, goes back to Betulia, shows the Jews, and they win a war. So that is the apocryphal version of the story of Judith. And that some have suggested is the source. However, numerous people point out major problems with this story, and particularly major problems with this being the source for our halachas of having cheese on Hanukkah and women lighting the menorah. A few of the problems. Number one is the Christians who actually have it as part of their Bible. A few Christian websites I went on, unfortunately, for the research in this year, already point out there are major historical problems with this, with the text. There was no one called Nebuchadnezzar who was the king of the Assyrians. He was the king of Bovel. Holofernes is a Greek name. Doesn't really make much sense. The geography of the book is wrong. There's majorly different details in different books. The Rishonim who we saw, for example, the Ran quoted a Medrash. It does not seem that the Ran would have referred to an apocryphal work as a Medrash. There's also halachic inaccuracies in the work. For example, the Ammonite Achior converts to Judaism following the Jews' victory, which is obviously a major problem because we know that if someone is known as an Amori, then they are not allowed to convert to Judaism because of a particular story that happened in the time of Tanakh. This no longer applies nowadays, but due to a particular act of cruelty that the Ammonites did, They're not allowed to convert. Nonetheless, in this story, we have an Ammonite converting. And generally speaking, it's an incredibly vague story and major historical inaccuracies. And it seems unlikely that this is the work which we base our halachos on in order to say that women have to light the menorah, etc., etc. I mean, that's a Gemara, but for the minhagim, and is this really the story? For these very reasons, this is by the way, a bit of fragment from the Septuagint, which is the very early Greek translation of the Tanakh, which also features Judith in it, the apocryphal work. But for these problems, Rabbi Yaakov Emden writes very strongly that Zeh Dover Bodoi, Ki be'emes, the idea that a woman contributed to the Hanukkah miracle is wild and absurd. Ki be'emes ein shaychus klal lenoshim b'neis Hanukkah. There is absolutely no link between women and the miracle of Hanukkah. Rav Yaakov Emden basically takes an extreme position, and he says we find no real makar for this. This apocryphal work of Judith is absolutely not a good makar, and therefore actually some of the Rishonim may have written it. They're all wrong. We have no reason to believe that a woman was involved in the nace. This woman called Judith, we don't know who she is. The only Judith that Rabbi Yaakov Emden had in his Tanakh was the wife of Esau, and that's basically Rabbi Yaakov Emden's quite extreme opinion. Most people don't agree with this, including the many people who do believe that women were part of the miracle. So where actually is the makar? What actually is the picture here? Where do we know this from? So I've got a suggestion, which I've heard and read in a few papers, and it goes as follows. Just first of all, to get the story clear, hopefully it won't take more than 5 more minutes, but obviously feel free to leave. We have a yotzer, which is one of the additional piyutim, which some older congregations recite during certain times of the year. And one of the yotzers is a beautiful yotzer called Odcha Kionafta, which is said on the Shabbos of Hanukkah. Here's just a page from it with a beautiful picture from the Rothschild collection of the Odcha Kionafta yotzer, and involves a lovely picture of Yehudis chopping someone's head off. Either way, it's a very poetic yotzer, very hard to translate. It's in your source sheets if you're more interested in it. I'll post those again at the end of share. But in effect, it splits the story into 2. There were 2 stories that occurred. Number 1, there was a daughter of Yochanan the Kohen Gadol, and she was about to be brought to the palace of what the local Greek officers, because there was a gezerah from the Greeks that any newly married woman had to first go and spend the night with the local Greek officer before being able to be married to their husband. And this happened for a few months, a few years, until the daughter of Yochanan Kohen Gadol, she basically said enough is enough. She caused a scene at her own wedding, convinced her brothers, Matisyahu, and her nephews, Yehuda the Maccabee, to basically go with her to the palace of the Greek general, the Greek king. They pulled a trick and they managed to slice off his head. That is story number 1. Story number 2 is that post this, a few years post this, or quite soon post this, unclear from the Yotzer, the Greeks got particularly angry because of this story, and they sent a belligerent army to capture the city, to kill many Jews as possible, because the royal priestly family had killed one of their generals in an audacious trick, one might say Mossad worthy, in order to kill one of the generals. And at this point, that Yehudis jumps into the story, and Yehudis goes details very different from the original apocryphal work. She goes and she similar details as well. She manages to sneak into the camp and chop off the general's head. So he clearly, the Yotzer written in the time of the Rishonim in the 1100s, clearly splits into 2 different stories, and we have numerous sources that this is what the Rishonim believed happened. First of all, this Yotzer, it's clear that Rashi had it. Rashi actually brings it in Yechezkel to explain a translation of a word. So this is presumably what Rashi meant when Rashi was discussing the miracle that happened through women and they all escaped. That's referring to the first story, when Chana, that was her name, the daughter of Yochanan Kohen Gadol, managed to break into the palace of the local Greek general and kill him, and then everyone escaped. We also have the Aruch HaShulchan, later Achron, who writes the same thing. He says that was two different stories here. There was some of the miracles happened through a woman. There was a time when they decreed that all married women had to have relations with the local leader first. And that's what Rashi is referring to in Shabbos. Va'od, after a period of time, Nasa Nesal Yedei Yehudis, Shehishkasa Esaev Chelev, Cholov, where she fed the enemy milk, and that's the second part of the story. So, nonetheless, we have a early Yotzer, and we also have an Aruch HaShulchan, but these are not primary sources. So in no way would these compete with an apocryphal work. So what's going on? So for many centuries, it was unclear where the Makar is. But thankfully, in the recent years, there have been findings in numerous libraries around the world and in the Cairo Geniza. And we now have new collections of Rishonim from certain Ksavei Yad, which have made their ways into our hands, which is very good. And there's two very, very interesting midrashim, which I didn't bring on the PowerPoint, but they're on your source sheets. There's a Medrash Maisa Chanukah, a Medrash Chanukah, and there's also a book we found in the Cairo Geniza called the Megillas Tainus, which was written in the times of the Gemara, which clearly has the first story, at least, not the story of Yehudis, but has the first story, which is a primary Makar. And furthermore, we have these two Midrashim, and I'll very briefly tell you the story in both of them. They're both incredibly interesting, and they paint the same picture. And these Midrashim, which unfortunately I'm not a historian, I haven't had access to the libraries, so I can't verify what dates they were written in, whether they are from the times of the Rishonim or from the times of the Gemaras or the Tanoim in the times of the Mishnah. But both the Midrashim paint the following picture. The Greeks started off with Gezeros, like writing that Hashem's is worthless, Ein Lonu Chelek in Hashem, on the cow horns, which we know very well. And so the Jews had to sell all their cows because none of the Jews wanted to write this on the horns of their cows. So the Jews sold all their cows. Then they made a decree to write on all their doors of their houses that we have no chelek in Hashem's Elokei Yisrael. And so all the Jews removed the doors from their houses. The Gezeros kept on getting stronger and stronger until eventually they made this gezerah about all the newly married brides having relations with the local governor. And that was the gezerah. And then they bring the first story as per the Aruch HaShulchan and as per the Yotzer of the daughter of Yochanan Kohen Gadol. One of them has the daughter of Matisyahu, the granddaughter of Yochanan Kohen Gadol, going and slicing off his head with her brothers and uncles and nephews, basically starting the war. And then later on, the Medrash talks about the other story then the local Greeks got particularly angry and sent a punitive task force to destroy many Jews. And then Yehudis steps onto the picture and she manages to sneak into the enemy camps. Details, again, different from the apocryphal version. She manages to sneak into the enemy camp, chop off his head, and it was very good for Klal Yisrael. So generally speaking, these Midrashim, however early they are, seem to have been, to an extent, what the Rishonim based their stories on, what they assumed our Minhagim were based on. It is very plausible that the stories took place in some description, and the Apocrypha wrote some version of the story, the Midrashim wrote another version of the story. Seems to be a more accurate version of the story based on the huge inaccuracies within the Apocrypha. And based on these Midrashim, and from the early Rishonim, it seems to be that these are the primary sources for the story of Yehudis. And unlike Rabbi Yaakov Emden, who says that Yehudis just happens to be a wife of Esav and there was no actual one called Yehudis, it seems that there is very much a strong strong sourcing within the Jewish tradition that there was a woman called Yehudis, and she was an integral part of the Hanukkah story. So much so that the Tunisians have a minhag to have this chag bonus on Hanukkah, and we have cheesy foods, and women light the menorah. And so we thank womankind, and thank you for joining me. That's the end of the share. If anyone has any questions, please do post them in chat. I'll stay on for a few minutes. I'll try and answer them. I can't promise. And I hope you enjoyed. The recording should hopefully be up on the Nair website, on YouTube. And thank you again. Yes, any questions, please do ask.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, hello. Can you buy the Sefer Chitzonim in a forum shop?
You won't be able to buy them in a Sforim shop, but you would be able to buy them from Oxford University, and they're all online as well. Sfaria.com, which is an incredible website.
Do they have
got many of the Macabees. You can find them all in Hebrew, with many of them with a translation.
They're
Can't
published
say
in
I'd
Hebrew.
advise reading all of them based on the beginning of the share, but yeah, you definitely be able to find
They are
them.
published.
They are published, yes. Oxford University has an edition. Cambridge, I think, has an edition. Many Christians have them as part of their Tanakh.
They do. Yes.
And extended, so they are very much a part of certainly some religions' traditions. Yeah.
And how did you get interested in this?
To be honest, I started off. I thought, let's give a share on Hanukkah. What's an interesting topic? So I thought Yehudis, and then I read the Apocrypha on it, or I started reading it, and it talked about Nebuchadnezzar and Bovel. So I thought, oh, that's not going to be a great share, is it? Because it didn't actually happen. And from there, I did a good month of research into the topic, and it was all very interesting. So I shared some of that this evening, and I hope you enjoyed it.
Yes, yes, sure. Thank you.
Any other questions, please do ask in chat or in person. I've got a very question. Would I be eating cheese? No, I'm not a particular fan of cheesy foods. Either way, fine. So thank you again. Thank you so much for joining me. The source sheets, if anyone wants to look at them now, I'll just post them again on the group. So that's the source sheet. If you'd like to look at anything again, if you do have any questions, please be in touch. I can even put my email in, but it's probably not a good idea. Please be in touch, or just ask them there, and they'll send me a message. So yeah, thank you for joining me. I hope you enjoyed, and have a lovely evening.
That's great. Thank you.